and I am going to be doing a presentation on the UW-Madison EconEx Fed Monetary Policy Externship Project. We are going to be showing basically the current economic environment, what kind of things we can expect in the future, and what kind of measures the Fed should take in order to return to full production following the incidence of COVID. So here, because housing is one of the largest and most paid attention to industry or indicators in the U.S. economy, I've here put the change in housing permits versus the number of housing sales on a month-to-month basis. As we can see here, there was a large decrease across the Great Recession, and we've also seen a large decrease in following the incidence of COVID-19. One of the more concerning aspects of this is the scope of this decline. As we can see across this change, we had a 48% decline in the number of housing permits through the Great Recession. Now that is clearly a very large decline, and this shows that there was obviously a lot less houses being built, and it's kind of concerning for the future. But in comparison to right now, to the COVID-19 crisis, we have seen a 30% decrease already, which shows that this is there's a really low confidence in the future going forward for development. There have been complications due to COVID, and that is a big concern for the time being. Moving on, we can see that the Fed has lowered their interest rates to zero in order to attempt to stimulate the economy and keep things moving, keep capital cheap for the time being. The same kind of measures that was taken in 2008. We can see that there's also been a large uptake in the number of securities held by the Fed in order to try and inject cash in the economy. Looking at the producer side, we can see that the producer price index has seen a sharp decline, as well as crude oil prices. This is important as it shows that are seeing prices decline for producers across the board. Largely, it is likely because this large decline in oil prices, oil being one of the largest factors of production globally. Moving on to the current inflation measures that are being faced across 2018, we can see that that we were really bouncing around the Fed target of 2%. However, following the instance of COVID-19, we did see a large decrease in most measures, which is very concerning because it shows that we may be fighting deflationary pressures going forward. Now, looking at the WTO's forecast for real GDP and world merchandise trade, we are seeing across the board really a decline going into 2020, which is going to be kind of as a result of COVID, as a result of decline in employment level, which will be discussed later. And this is kind of a concern, but we do see, thankfully, that they are forecasting an increase going into 2021 for world merchandise sales as well as real GDP. So going into the change in employment level following the instance of COVID-19, we really saw the largest decline in employment level in going between these 2 months. As we can see here, there were various industries that were really affected differently, but across the board, basically, there was a really large decrease. Now, to put these numbers kind of into perspective, we can look here at what percentage of each of these large industries was lost. As you can see here, leisure and hospitality had a large decline. That is we can kind of inference based on that. Really, leisure and hospitality, a lot of person-to-person interaction, and due to COVID-19, obviously that is not possible any longer. However, as we can see, with education and health services being a very large industry in itself, this large decrease is only accounting for 12% of the overall employment level, which is on the plus side, is that is not, the industry is not as much affected. However, it does show that there's really been a very, very large decline in employment levels across the board. So we can see here just how this marks up to the past recession that we have seen. So this graph is compiled basically to overlap the shocks to the economy. So I've lined them up so you can see in comparison when the Great Recession had first experienced its shock, and in comparison to COVID-19, as we can see, there's a much larger decline as a result of COVID-19 than we ever saw with the Great Recession. Great Recession was much more gradual, had a smaller decline than we've seen, and clearly the one from COVID is very much more volatile, and this could be because it is just this crisis, it has not been seen before. Um, Moving on into thinking about the future. So, like I said, this is really something that we haven't seen before, and we need to consider that moving forward. So, in order to do this, I drew this back to a microeconomic model, the Fisher model, which basically shows consumer purchasing in the face of a change in interest rates, as well while consumers consider their income today and income tomorrow. Essentially, the takeaway from this is that, as we can see from this gray dot and these gray lines here, that shows basically if we were to consume all of our income today and tomorrow, how much we could consume, or if we consumed none of our income today and all of it tomorrow, how much we can consume, and really where, given a individual consumer, where they would lie. Now, this is compiled using personal income gathered by the St. Louis Fed, and then also compared to personal consumption expenditures. Now, as personal consumption expenditures is really the largest measure of inflation that the Fed likes to look at, this is kind of influential in my choosing of this variable. By doing so, basically what I have done here is I've compared different levels of personal income for different dates across the 2008 recession, and showed that given about the same level of personal income in the first period, the quote unquote today, and given the subsequent level of personal income in the future, that we can show where consumers decide to consume. Based on the personal consumption expenditures. So essentially what this does is, by going from this dot here representing our personal consumption expenditures with a higher interest rate to our personal consumption expenditures with a lower interest rate, essentially what we can show is that by lowering interest rates, the Fed will over time increase the level of personal consumption. Now, this is a plus, as it shows, again, combating that deflationary measures that we are hoping to avoid, but it shows that this near zero interest rates do have a positive effect on that consumption, which is a plus. Moving forward, I did a little bit of forecasting on this, but really the problem with collecting this data is the fact that, again, it is not seen historically. This forecast was built on past historical data, and so we can really hope that based on all those past data points going back to 1977, that we will see personal consumption falling within this range. However, it is completely possible that we do not. Essentially, take away this is that in that agreeing with the WTO's forecast, that basically we will see a decline in consumption going forward. This will hurt the U.S. economy moving forward. However, we can hope that the Fed's zero interest rates will promote an uptake of capital for producers. This will make capital cheaper for them and make total production increase going forward. Now, the real problem with this is whether these businesses can stay afloat in the meantime. So that brings us to the first policy recommendation, which the first policy recommendation would be keeping near zero interest rates for the upcoming year, or for the rest of the year, in order to promote this cheap uptake in capital while we weather through COVID. The hope with this is that this cheaper capital will allow for, again, the greater production numbers in the future, but when we return to higher employment levels, we will really hope that the higher employment levels combined with a higher level of capital will increase production in the future. And we have seen from our data analysis that these measures are very highly correlated between personal consumption and employment levels, that increasing consumption does go along with increasing employment levels. We can hopefully draw that from our going back to our Fisher model, that these zero interest rates will increase that consumption, and the lower interest rates and the higher consumption will be reflected in a correlated higher employment level. Now, this brings us to the second policy measure, which is basically waiting until we are able to, or policy recommendation, excuse me, waiting until we get to that return to employment level. When we are able to get through COVID-19 and when we are able to go back to higher employment levels, we don't know when that will come. It is really kind of uncertain at the moment, which shows us that what we should do is or comes the recommendation of the Fed should extend their loans, their security uptake, and essentially double down the measures that were taken in early March in order to keep businesses afloat and allow them to weather through COVID-19 until we are able to get more people employed and return to full production and much lower unemployment. That concludes the presentation here. So thank you for taking the time to listen to me.